Good evening, everyone, on a very hot June evening. My name is Christine Kennedy, and on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening as we celebrate National Indigenous History Month with an exciting talk about how cultural resource management archaeology, otherwise known as CRM, is providing meaningful dialogue between non-Indigenous archaeologists and the Indigenous communities. Tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from three individuals in this field. Allan Jones is a McMaster graduate who is an associate archaeologist and project manager for the Site Mitigation Practice area of Archaeological Services, Inc. That's the company. Joining him is Tanya Hill Montour. She is from the Six Nations of the Grand River, and she is an archaeologist supervisor. And Dr. Dawn Martin Hill is a professor emeritus of Indigenous Studies here at McMaster, and she was the first Indigenous cultural anthropologist in Canada, and she's joining for the conversation as well. So thank you to all three of you for joining us this evening. For those joining in, just a reminder, this talk is being recorded as always, and you'll have the opportunity to watch it again and or share with friends. You'll get a link to that recording later this evening. And if you have any questions for our panel tonight, please feel free to submit those in the space provided below your screen, and we'll get to those after the formal presentation. For those of you who are joining us, always know that we start our events with a land acknowledgement, and tonight Allan has the honor of making this recognition. So thank you, Allan and Tanya and Dawn, for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you, Allan, to start off with the land acknowledgement, and then we'll go into the presentation.
Thank you so much, Christine. So as part of our territorial land acknowledgement tonight, we acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations, and more recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land is covered under the Dish with One Spoon wampum covenant belt, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe to share and care for the land and resources around the Great Lakes. I would also like to take this time to further recognize the Indigenous community within this region that was dispersed and their descendants brought into the Haudenosaunee. In 1615, Samuel de Champlain noted a society located between the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat, who remained neutral in conflicts between those nations. Hence, the French called them the neutral nation. The first documented European visit to the neutral was in 1626 by a Recollet missionary, Joseph de la Roche d'Allion, who recorded visits to the Adirondran villages, a name meaning those who speak a slightly different tongue, used reciprocally by both the neutral and the Wendat peoples. So I'm just going to continue on here. The neutral, like their neighbors, lived in settled agricultural villages, growing crops such as maize, pumpkins, and squash. Since the days of Samuel de Champlain, we have identified clusters of neutral or ancestral neutral settlements in several parts of southern Ontario, including the Lower Grand River, Spencer and Bronte Creek, Grimsby, and Niagara Escarpment regions. Between 1647 and 1651, the Adirondran were overcome by endemics brought on by the contact with missionaries from Europe, as well as European trade goods. They were ultimately dispersed by the Haudenosaunee and welcomed into their communities, as the Haudenosaunee temporarily settled in strategic locations along the north shore of Lake Ontario. These Haudenosaunee settlements were smaller and less intensive than those in New York State, and served primarily as seasonal bases for beaver hunting expeditions. I chose this map as a nice background for this slide because in this map, if you look very closely, or if you get the chance to look at Samuel de Champlain's map in its full context online, you'll be able to zoom in on the lower Great Lakes area and notice a series of villages with very different styles of house construction, as well as fields surrounding them. And even Samuel de Champlain noted the exact number of longhouses or homes associated with these villages. Samuel de Champlain's record of the region.
Sorry, Allan, I don't think you're screen sharing, so I don't think we can see the wonderful pictures you were referring to.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it not still sharing from before? I thought it was still sharing from before. My apologies. I've gone through several slides all without sharing. Let me see if I can fix that right now. Sorry. This one. Is that not still sharing?
Oh, there we go.
My apologies to the audience there.
That's perfect.
So yes, this map, as I was saying, put together by Samuel Champlain. I encourage anyone who has an opportunity to go and look at Samuel de Champlain's writings or even his maps of the Lower Great Lakes region in Canada to take a look at them. They're very interesting, very ornate, and they do come from a European's perspective, so there's obviously that bias, but at the same time, they do depict an account at the time he arrived in Canada. So moving on, why are we here? The purpose of this presentation is to show how both public sector archaeology and private sector archaeology is engaging in meaningful dialogue with Indigenous communities, which is an integral part of truth and reconciliation. It's part of transforming our research relationships, respecting Indigenous sovereignty, and co-authoring new pathways forward. Today, CRM archaeology is the dominant form of archaeology in Ontario. It's not research archaeology, it's CRM, which is private archaeology. It's shaped by development pressures and legal frameworks. And archaeology itself is not just technical, it's political, ethical, and deeply cultural. I'd like to remind everyone in the audience that archaeology is not a neutral discipline. It tries to be as much as it can be, but like all disciplines, there's biases that permeate through everything. And these biases can do great damage. So those who employ the teachings of archaeology hold the unique power to both destroy cultural heritage and heal historical harms through truth and reconciliation. So how did archaeology in Canada start? Like, what was the interest? Why did they care, right? Archaeology in Canada started as a settler colonial project, whereby European settlers were collecting and seeking out Indigenous remains to show off to their guests as oddities. They would sell them or trade them to collectors. The material remains were displayed without consent from Indigenous communities. When self-proclaimed archaeologists or academics entered the scene, they justified the removal of Indigenous remains and cultural heritage by stating it was to save them from looters or to study them for academic purposes, to improve the well-being of Indigenous descendants. That was the justification they provided. So we have a long period of history where Indigenous remains are stored, studied without regard for Indigenous laws or protocols. Museums and institutions often hold artifacts without consent, and research is carried out without community benefit or knowledge sharing. As a result, sites are documented but not protected. Artifacts are held far from descendants. They're removed from the landscape in their entirety, thereby also destroying the archaeological site itself. Indigenous communities at this time in Canada's past were framed as part of the past, subject to be casually studied for one's interest, and they were not part of the present future. So I would like to introduce two of these archaeologists. I don't want to get too long into the past history of Canada, so I try and keep this a little bit short. I'd like to start with David Boyle. He is the first provincial archaeologist of Ontario, curator at the Ontario Provincial Museum, precursor to the ROM. So widely recognized as the first professional archaeologist in Canada, he excavated many sites, including burial grounds such as Neutral and Wendat villages and ossuary sites, built the Ontario Provincial Museum's collection through excavations and acquisitions, and used language consistent with salvage archaeology. Boyle excavated a lot of these sites without the consent of Indigenous communities. Boyle amassed large collections and large assemblages that are now still stored in some cases at the ROM to this day. And again, Boyle was one of those archaeologists that promoted the idea of rescuing Indigenous heritage to further reinforce the myth of the vanishing Indigenous person, subject to be studied, picked apart for scholarly endeavor. So sacred Indigenous archaeological sites were removed from the landscape, destroyed, and no longer accessible to the Indigenous community that they were so deeply related to. Boyle also had a history of collaborating with collectors and amateur archaeologists to acquire these collections and also engaged in unsanctioned excavations. Another gentleman who, or I should say the archaeological folk, who was carrying out work at this time as well in consultation with Boyle was Andrew F. Hunter. Andrew F. Hunter is widely regarded as a historian. I put on this slide the plaque that's in Simcoe County to this day. Andrew F. Hunter provided a history of Simcoe County, which blended local settler history with archaeological observations, collected artifacts, collaborated with Boyle, and recorded and undertook excavations on burial sites and villages across central Ontario. So again, not a great track record. He also fabricated local histories and romanticized settler narratives that degraded Indigenous communities' presence on the landscape, positioning descendants of Indigenous communities as part of the past to be overridden by European settlers. So I wanted to also bring to our attention to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action, particularly calls to action 67 and 70. These are related specifically to heritage in Canada. They urge the federal government, in partnership with Indigenous peoples, to review and reform museums and archival practices across Canada to ensure they align with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, otherwise known as UNDRIP. These actions emphasize the importance of truth-telling and commemoration of Indigenous experiences. They are especially those experiences in residential schools. They call for national funding, policy reviews, and educational initiatives to support reconciliation, transparency, and Indigenous sovereignty over cultural heritage and historical narratives. So these calls to action are to urge heritage professionals like myself as well, and the institutions that I work with, to work with Indigenous communities to tell the truth about the past and share authority over the storytelling and narrative in archaeology. This is something that has generally been absent from Archaeology Ontario until relatively recently, and there is still much work to be done. So, as I said before, CRM archaeology is the dominant form of archaeology in Ontario. It's business-driven, dictated by legislative requirements that stem from the Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act and the Ontario Heritage Act, which afford archaeological sites with legal protections. Property assessments and site excavations have budgets, employees, overhead costs. Oh, apparently that's the next slide. And CRM is typically performed on timelines, timelines and budgets in the context of housing and infrastructure projects, as well as resource developments. CRM is where the real impact or damage happens in Ontario archaeology. And I would like to believe that most archaeologists in the field today have this career in mind with the purpose of studying Ontario heritage for the benefit of Indigenous communities, but that is not always the case. So, Ontario archaeological site excavations. Archaeological sites can only be excavated by provincially licensed archaeologists, such as myself. CRM has created an environment where site excavations are beholden to Indigenous communities' interests, and engagement is performed. Companies have budgets and proponent timelines in mind with municipal governments and community interests. The approval of the excavations reports and the clearing of an archaeological site report passes through the Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism, which has an archaeological program unit that licenses archaeologists like me. This system has made archaeological excavations more of a for-profit activity that is capitalist driven, and in some cases for all parties involved. So I wanted to give a brief rundown of how we do these site assessments and where there's problems with the site assessment and the engagement that we do in archaeology, because it's not all perfect. So what we have is a 4-stage process. It does not require licensees to engage with Indigenous communities at all stages, which is a big problem. Permits to collect artifacts without Indigenous community engagement or consultation is part of the process in some cases. There's set standards for the assessment as well, and Indigenous communities do not always agree with the standards and guidelines that we have. So, stage 1, first stage. there's no Indigenous engagement at this stage. Stage 1 involves a review of available information to assess the archaeological potential of a property. It includes identifying known registered archaeological sites on or near the subject lands, and it examines the area's environmental characteristics, soils, landforms, water sources, and reviews the historical and current land use of the property, all to evaluate the likelihood of discovering an archaeological site. At this stage, a lot of data is put into reports, and a lot of this data, there's no input from the community about the history that's told in the report. And so in this stage, we can have archaeologists with old dated knowledge come onto the scene and put data in a report together, pass it through the ministry, all without any Indigenous engagement at all, discussing it with the communities that are related or covered under the treaty of that territorial land. So stage 2 assessment is the next phase. So this is a field survey, usually involving a pedestrian survey of the property. And depending on the land conditions, you may be able to plow it, turning over the soils, letting it weather and walking it. Or if you're not able to plow the field area, you'll do a test pit survey at systematic intervals, and you'll assess through 30 centimeter diameter test pits. And you'll screen the soil, you collect all the artifacts and everything related to it. Problems with this: Indigenous engagement and consultation, not required under the standards and guidelines. One of the biggest things that I hear about in my job as well is that Indigenous communities want to be consulted at this stage. And that's definitely something that we always encourage in my company. We always encourage proponents to begin consultation with Indigenous communities as early as possible in the process. Artifacts can be recovered and retained by the licensed archaeologist without Indigenous communities being informed as well, is another big problem. It's sort of similar to what Boyle or Andrew F. Hunter was able to do. There is the potential for previously undocumented sites on the property to experience further disturbance by the action of plowing. So we may have a property that has not been plowed in 50 years, or was only plowed seldomly every now and again. And so the site may be relatively intact. And at no point does anyone say, to the Indigenous community that is most related to that land, well, are you okay with us plowing up that site? Are you okay with us turning it over and walking that area to check for an archaeological site? That question isn't even asked to the Indigenous communities. So again, that exposes the site to further disturbance when it may not be necessary or desirable to the Indigenous community. Stage 3, site-specific assessment. Here we get into where Indigenous engagement is required, but consent is not necessarily part of that. So stage 3 assessment, it's following site identification at stage 2. Stage 3 assessment is designed to identify the limits of the site. It involves the placement of test units at 5-meter intervals or a set interval uniform, just depending on the site, as well as particularly other steps depending on the scale of the site. Some sites require greater levels of stage 3 assessment than others. So the stage 3 assessment is conducted again to determine the cultural heritage value of the site. All that is determined by what the standards and guidelines say about site integrity. Is this site important? Does it meet these criteria according to the standards and guidelines that are agreed to by the government? That were fairly, they were created in consultation with Indigenous communities, the standards and guidelines. However, the standards and guidelines are not necessarily agreed to by all Indigenous communities. And in some cases, Indigenous communities have their own standards and guidelines now that are entering the world. So yeah, it typically stage 3 assessment involves surface collection, testing, excavation, sometimes test trenches, and it's all in accordance with the standards and guidelines. Indigenous communities are consulted by proponents and must be allowed on the property. Archaeologists engage with participating Indigenous communities. Indigenous community consultation firms have contracts with the proponents when proponents are agreeing to those contracts. And they will have, in most cases with such contracts, Indigenous monitors present on site to oversee and work with archaeologists on the ground level. I will say that I don't think I've ever had an archaeological site I've worked on an excavation for without an Indigenous monitor present with me on site or being engaged with. Except I would say the only one exception to that might be a stage 2 assessment, but when it's an actual, we have a site on the ground that I'm working on, I've always had Indigenous monitors present with me. So Indigenous communities may request accommodations during fieldwork. They will bring these often to a field director on site and may even go as far as talking to the involved consultation firm through email and other chains. These accommodations are to help ensure that the sites are excavated to meet the community's interests. So here we have a situation, though, as you're seeing from this, that it's archaeology dictated by capitalism. Stage 4 mitigation, final stage of archaeological assessment in CRM. Two options. So stage 4 mitigation is about mitigating development impacts to an archaeological site. And it's about analyzing the remaining cultural heritage value or interest of the site. Stage 4 mitigation, when it's required, it is a very cost-intensive process. It's a very large assessment typically. And there are two options that proponents have to choose between. Avoidance and protection is the first. This is where the site is avoided and protected in the landscape, where we take and developers will say, I'm not going to develop in this area. We're going to put buffers around the site to protect it. There'll be no-go buffers, and they will be an area that may or may not be fenced off. But the site will be then, property will then be passed on to a municipality, and there'll be typically through a subdivision agreement, there'll be a condition placed on those lands so that no development or ground disturbing activities can occur in the archaeological site, thereby preserving the landscape. This is the most desirable option to the Indigenous communities because it prevents the vacuuming of their archaeological heritage from the site, or from the landscape, I should say. And it allows the site to stay in its original context. Archaeological site removal is a destructive process. And it's one thing to consider that when we remove a site, it's gone and we lose parts of data that may be in the ground still. And so there's no opportunity for future techniques to be used on the site at a later date if there was ever that desire. So typically with the removal of a large site, you'll have the testing and excavation go across it. Contiguous block units will be excavated 1 by 1 meters to certain extents defined by the standards and guidelines. And if you're dealing with a large woodland village, such as the picture you're seeing here, all of the green outlines you're seeing there are all longhouses. This is a very great and amazing site. I encourage anyone that wants to learn about the Mantle site to look up on YouTube. There's a video there called Curse of the Axe, not by choice of the excavators that it was named that, but it is a documentary about the amazing finds of this site and the amazing archaeology done on it. So again, same problems exist at stage 3, or exist at stage 4 that were in stage 3, whereby we have Indigenous monitors are allowed to provide comments and concerns about the archaeological site, but they don't necessarily have to be listened to by the archaeologist. The archaeologist will listen to them, but not necessarily have to do the accommodation that's requested, because the accommodation is approved in most cases by the proponent, and thereby, this damages Indigenous communities' relationship with the archaeologist on the ground. So I'm going to move on to the next slide here. This is the bulletin for engaging with Indigenous communities in archaeology. It's a draft technical bulletin. It's funny, never got past draft stage, but it's something we follow in archaeology. I don't know why it never left draft stage. Best to ask the Ministry of Tourism and Culture, or now I guess the Ministry of Multiculturalism and Citizenship. This bulletin is intended to help the licensed archaeologist engage Indigenous communities in archaeology as effectively as possible. It summarizes the direction on Indigenous community engagement set out in the standards and guidelines for consultant archaeologists, and provides information and resources to assist consultant archaeologists in successfully following the standards and guidelines. In this context, engagement means involving Indigenous communities in each stage of an archaeological problem. Just involve them. It doesn't mean, agree to everything you say. It means involve them. So as a result, Indigenous communities can present their interests in each stage of the archaeological project, but those interests may not be followed. Like the ask or the desired accommodations may not be carried out, as budgets and timelines often affect whether they'll be accepted by proponents. Archaeology is particularly relevant to Indigenous communities because it is so archaeology is particularly relevant to Indigenous communities because it can help to document Indigenous communities' histories. The people that are allowed to identify with sacred sites and ancestral remains. Engaging Indigenous communities in archaeology is going to improve our understanding of the archaeological project as well and enrich the archaeological record. The process demonstrates respect for Indigenous interests and heritage, recognizes Indigenous peoples' connection to the land, and allows everyone to benefit from their knowledge. Engagement considers the interest of Aboriginal communities in the archaeological assessment, the protection of archaeological or Indigenous archaeological sites, and the dispossession of Indigenous artifacts and ancestral remains as well. It is all, sorry, I'm just gonna have a small sip of water here. Or it should say coffee, because it's that time of the evening. Oh, where was I here? So engagement considers the interests of Indigenous communities in the archaeological assessment, the protection of Indigenous archaeological sites, and the dispossession of Indigenous artifacts and ancestral remains. It also seeks to build relationships with Indigenous communities that will facilitate their engagement in future projects. Effective engagement requires good planning and begins early in the project. The Ministry of Citizenship and Multiculturalism is committed to continually reviewing the technical bulletin with Indigenous communities and archaeological stakeholders, such as myself, and will update the bulletin as needed to ensure that it is helpful, effective, and current. The ministry welcomes feedback from Indigenous communities and archaeologists on this bulletin. However, I have never seen this bulletin updated ever. I don't think it's ever been updated. So, moving on from the technical mumbo jumbo of ministry standards and guidelines. Compliance versus consent. Ethical crossroads. CRM development, Indigenous rights. There is no legal requirement for Indigenous consent. It doesn't exist. So projects can be carried out and go through and be considered, and the reports can go through the ministry and be considered compliant. And all the while, Indigenous communities may not actually consent to the work that was done. This is a major gap in the ethical process for archaeology in Ontario. True reconciliation requires going beyond the minimum legal standard, which Ontario archaeology firms are not contracted by proponents to do. So again, individual community members' concerns can be challenged or even disregarded on site. Sites can be destroyed before the properties are cleared, all without any consultation. There's a lack of adequate time afforded for Indigenous communities to review projects and the assessment's results. Ceremonial and cultural practices may be disregarded as accommodation is at the discretion of proponents. And Indigenous monitors may be excluded or only added in the later stages of a project. So what reconciliation can look like in Ontario archaeology? Reconciliation in Ontario archaeology means embedding Indigenous leaderships and laws into the process, not just consulting. It involves, sharing control and the direction of excavations, which I do try and do in my everyday work. I do work on the regular with field directors in the field that are consulting Indigenous miners. I myself was a field director before in the field consulting with Indigenous miners on the ground. And we want to meet, as a good ethical archaeologist, we want to meet all the requests and accommodations from Indigenous community members that are on our sites. And we do make every effort that we can. But there comes the point where developers say, I don't want to pay for this. And so cost holds back archaeologists from doing further work. And it's such a challenging thing as someone who was in the field, because at the end of the day, I'm not there as an archaeologist just excavating because I find it fun or interesting or anything like that. I'm there to recover the past for Indigenous communities that are here today, recover what I can to the best quality I can, and get that history or give that heritage site best protections possible so that it can be shared and enjoyed by the Indigenous descendants that are here today. And it is sort of a frustrating realm when you're working on site and you're not able to meet an accommodation request, because it can be something as simple as you have this particular artifact on an edge and the Ministry Standards and Guidelines say, don't go any further, but there's more stuff going beyond that area. But the Standards and Guidelines say, you don't need to because that's the cutoff. But Indigenous community monitors may say, well, I'm really concerned about that item, that one item there on the edge. Can you just do one extra bit? And depending on the project's timelines or its budgets, you may get the answer of, no, we can't, because developers don't want to pay for it. And it's a very unfortunate circumstance. I will say in many cases, I have made the effort to make those accommodations whenever possible. And I have taken out a whole series of extra units and then some to cover off an area. So examples of what this looks like in CRM today is CRM firms including considerations for potential Indigenous community accommodation requests into project timelines and budgets, ensuring Indigenous monitors are welcomed and fully informed about a project, empowered to stop work when they have concerns, including special protocols for ceremonial handing of ancestral remains consented to by interested Indigenous communities, and agreements for repatriation and curation of materials to Indigenous communities themselves. One of the sad things I think that still goes on today is that all of the material we collect out of the ground, all these artifacts and everything else related to a site, and all those things, they don't get handed over to the associated Indigenous community. Partially because there are sometimes differing interests between the Indigenous communities themselves about who is the appropriate person to receive that stuff, but also because all of it gets boxed up and held in trust by the Crown and is sent to a museum or a storage facility. And if you look it up right now on the internet, you can find all sorts of stuff about the Ontario artifact crisis, storage crisis that we're in, where we have pulled out so much material and we have boxes and boxes of it, but no one has capacity to store it. So without further ado, Tanya, I'd love to have your comments on the Six Nations and its work with McMaster University as we move into sort of how scholars engage.
Good evening. I'm just gonna pull up my slide that just popped off. So, good evening, everyone. I'm Tanya Hill Montour, the Archaeology Supervisor for Six Nations of the Grand River. I will also mention that I work alongside of the Mississaugas of the Credit and also the Haudenosaunee Development, and I feel that it's imperative and paramount that they're alongside of me while we all do this work together, because we are all transient people at one point, all nations traveling together. And I truly believe that we still need to continually to travel together. So I guess some of my roles and responsibilities within my position here is I do a lot of cultural awareness. So as you can hear Allan speak, it's there's a huge gap, and it's very unfortunate because First Nations people have this power control structure over top of us, and it's really colonial, and it's really sad, and it's really unfortunate, and and it's a colonial structure over our most important aspect of our lives is our identity and our heritage. So within my position, I spend a lot of time doing cultural awareness, so sort of decolonizing those Indigenous histories that are out there, because our history is not told from an Indigenous First Nations perspective. It's told from a very colonial settler way, because we've never had the opportunity to actually sit and be able to share. So as Allan has brought up through we'll stay focused right now. I could probably go on for forever on that, but let's stay focused on that Indigenous engagement bulletin that Allan has mentioned, where it's written very open-ended. It's written for interpretation of whoever the consulting archaeologist on site is, whoever becomes retained to that project. And that's very problematic, because again, I don't believe that anyone should have that power control structure over us to be able to interpret how we should be engaged on our history. So I spend a lot of time with that, a cultural awareness with archaeological companies, and there's no resistance. We all work together on mutual respect and have open conversation. And we do spend an ASI, for instance. We do engage on stage 1, stage 2, and they realize that the disparities there, and that we need to be at the table and be talking about our heritage at that stage. So thank Allan and ASI and many other companies who think that's important and paramount, because there is companies out there that we have challenges. Mississaugas of the Credit and HDI have also with trying to get proper engagement. So again, that standards and guidelines bulletin, Indigenous engagement, actually, Allan actually made it a little bit more friendlier. He wrote Indigenous engagement. It's actually written as Aboriginal engagement bulletin, which is very sad, and we can't even have the recognition of at least updating at least some terminology. So again, that bulletin sets out to how to engage, who to engage, why do we engage from their interpretation, again, which is completely problematic. So in my role through that cultural awareness, once again, I meet with municipalities, I meet with regions, and I ensure that they understand what our interest is. And, that's been, a long five years for me for that. And we'll get more into that. So again, my next role, I probably got an arm length of roles that I conduct. So we'll move into artifact storage, care, and control. And, Allan has also mentioned, that, once artifacts are mitigated and stored, they do become the possession of the Crown. They become possession of the license holder on site. And there's some really significant materials on site that it really leads me to wonder that failure on conducting our own ceremonies, like how they're holding our possessions, where we need those for we need those for our ceremonies, and here they have them in a box. And I want to mention that through a lot of my work for advocacy of trying to ensure that we have equity, because that is where this lies, that it's not equitable. We're basically still at the lowest of a totem pole with no voice. And when I had conversation with the ministry, they said, you know, Tanya, we're ready to give back, but we'll give back when you're ready. I said, okay, well, what does that mean? And that's when, you know, we have to have climate control building, we have to have proper facility to house. But, you know, that was kind of like a real chop off at the knees because, you know, no licensed archaeologist, if they decide that once they mitigate it, once it becomes in their possession, if they decide they want to have it on their side table of their living room, they can do that. Or if you know, we just got so much artifacts in my house, and I've spoke to different archaeologies with this mindset where, oh well, I got all these artifacts and now I got them out in a sea can in my backyard, and you know, it just, you know, continuously chops you off at the knees to have to hear these conversations. And you know, it's very sad and unfortunate, and I throw that back at the ministry all the time through my argument point that, you know, this is how you respect our heritage by just allowing, you know, people just to use, you know, our sacred materials for side pieces and storage inside sea cans. So anyways, I won't get completely into that, but that's just one, you know, understanding of, you know, that power control is, you know, a situation again where, you know, we don't have access to our artifacts. We have to have rules attached. Very unfortunate. Another part of my role is I'm considered the next of kin to the ancestors and then ancestral remains that become unfortunately unearthed and disrespectfully you know, unearthed on sites. And you know, it's a challenging and a heavy load to take, but you know what? Like, I'll explain, you know, my dad's done funeral and graves digging for over 50 years in the community. And I almost feel like this role was brought to me from some sort of sign from the universe because you know, like to be able to have to carry that in a professional way and make sure that they're respected and protected in a certain way. It's not an easy part, but you know, I do it and I make sure that happens and I don't let it contain me and bring me down. And you know, even though that some of that part of that role is very heavy, and we won't get into that too much, but I will say that we have conducted repatriation to date now, so that warms my heart that, you know, my 5-year mission has finally moved forward with ensuring that, you know, some ancestors that have been on the shelf for 50 years are now respectfully um, um, back to the earth where they belong. And you know, that warms my heart, and you know, I feel like it's one step in the right direction. And again, there was no ministries that helped for that. It was just people realizing the disparities and saying this is the right thing that we should be doing. We should not be doing this. And there was nobody to, you know, to enforce that. So, you know, that even warms my heart that, you know, there is people ethically still there to ensure that, you know, that proper care and control of our ancestors are taking place. So we'll go back and talk a little bit about the relationship that I build between municipalities and regions, because I feel like that's the important part, and it moves back into that critical stages of engagement within the stage 1s and 2s, because again, a lot of proponents, developers, they have to achieve a clearance letter or they have to achieve a development permit. And how does that happen? It happens at the municipality and the region level. So again, without the ministry, you know, changing and upgrading and getting their Indigenous engagement bulletin out of draft, well, I've been just kind of doing it on the side with the help of municipalities and regions to ensure that we are engaging at stage 1. This is our interest, and this is why. And hearing it from us, hearing it from communities, whether it's HDI or whether it's from Mississaugas of the Credit or myself, that this is the reason why we engage at stage 1. This is important, and this is where our interest lies. And a lot of times in those conversations in that stage 1, it's really challenging. I would have to say that I learned from municipalities and regions to be able to speak on our behalf to answer that why do we engage and how come and when. And So, that part's been, it's been very productive, and we're sitting now, the other communities and myself with, region of Waterloo, we're in city of Hamilton, Niagara region, city of Brantford. So now in Brant County, so all the adjacent areas to the community in Haldeman, we're now sitting in those development applications that are coming through, and ensuring that, the respect and the protections happen from our voice, and our respectful ways that we would like to see development move forward. Again, there's always a lot of different amendments and bills that come through, and we'll speak about those later this evening, that are now, sort of, we just get one step ahead and then we get thrown, one step behind. And I've been seeing a huge pattern of that. Free and prior consent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because that is where it's mostly, where it's kind of fallen behind on the wheel there. So education. So I've been working a lot with different educational institutions, like universities of McMaster, for instance, who've been, probably the paramount, they've been working really hard at ensuring that Indigenous engagement, free and prior consent, and our involvement of all communities are there now. And our values and our understanding on how we would like to see different practices within their facility. So Waterloo, for instance, we're working on GIS mapping. We still have a long way to go with that, but the conversation is there, which is important. McMaster, we're doing a lot of work with food sovereignty. We're working a lot alongside of clay sourcing. We're working alongside of them with a Sealy site, which I'll talk about in a couple other slides. Those projects are important, because that, again, that's bringing us together on that mutual respectful level, having our voice there, and ensuring that we're at the table. Because again, that free and prior consent, when they would be doing invasive or even non-invasive study on our artifacts, that's very problematic. Like, one day these artifacts are going to come home, and there's nothing really going to be left if we just keep on conducting research. So again, research is okay, but research has to be done responsive, and that is not what happened in the past. We had no involvement. So again, we try to construct some sort of protocols on what that would look like. So I also do a lot of work within different governmental levels. So again, I got the Chiefs of Ontario. I have the Keyway Table, which was established in 2012 with the result of the Ipperwash inquiry. So a lot of those practices and protocols that came out of the Ipperwash inquiry, we utilized those to how to protect the ancestors, protect archaeology, protect our people, and how we can move forward on in a respectful manner. Probably my biggest role is, is the supervisor of the on-site participation. So every year we have roughly around 30 to 35 monitors on site that participate with, ASI and different consulting archaeology companies to ensure that the respect and the protection is taking place on site. And as Allan mentioned, like, there is different accommodations that the monitors will request. So they'll reach out to me and say, I feel like we need to do more work here. So then I'll reach out to Allan and we'll have that conversation. And there's generally not, too much of a hassle there. Usually, like, as Allan has mentioned, it's, it's sort of like always becomes the cost, right? And it's sad that, there has to be dollar value to our heritage. And, I see it quite often, even with even avoidance and protection strategies, as Allan has mentioned, there was two ways to do the stage 4, right? Even sometimes the avoidance and protections becomes, a cost, very costly. And sometimes some don't want to even do it that way because they want to have their housing development and sector, and it's problematic, but I won't get too much into that because Alan kind of sort of explained some of that. But from an Indigenous perspective, we prefer avoidance and protection instead of going in and destroying our archaeological sites. Okay, so again, we talked a bit about the storage at McMaster at the Innovation Park. So we do have an MOU, Mississaugas of the Credit as well. Because sustainable archaeology, they're always opening up their doors for us to work together. So again, working together is so important. And like I said, as I mentioned in my opening, I always want to ensure that the Mississaugas of the Credit and HDI is also there to, because we all sort of bounce off each other with different ideas or different histories that we have, oral traditions, and we're able to share those. So I'm real thankful for Scott Martin and some of the work that he's been doing, because he's really working at hard and ensuring that reconciliation's happening on so many positive levels. And it really is. So we did work a few years ago on the Foodways project, where we took traditional foods and we try to study the proteins and lipids and on pottery. So old pottery shards, and we scraped them in a non-invasive manner, because that was one of my biggest issues, is I didn't want to see anything destroyed. So we were able to, scrape the proteins and the lipids in a way that was non-invasive, and we did get really good results. So a lot of the traditional foods that we talk about in our oral traditional ways, they actually were proven within that study. I won't get too much into that study because it's I do have pamphlets on it, and we're going to bring it back to the community. So again, a lot of these projects, we do have that strong emphasis on the community-led research and that relationship building with Indigenous partners, because again, there's truth telling there. You can't tell a story with only one side. So it's important for us to all to work together. And Jackie Porter was one of the students through our program who participated in the Foodways project with us. And so I guess I'll move on to Sorry, my dog started barking and it threw me off a little bit. So we do have the clay sourcing that's going to be starting up, and that's going to be a really exciting project where we're going to that's going to be sort of like part 2 of our food sovereignty project, where we're going to take clay. We're going to clay source in different areas. There's an area with clay sourcing on Six Nations on the second line. We're going to take the Sealy site, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And we're also going to take some clay sourcing from RBG, and we're going to recreate pottery, just like it was done by our ancestors. And then we're going to take that pottery and we're going to bake it at, the high temperatures, just like we did, many years ago. And then we're going to also cook and then get the results from the cooking, and take the pottery later, and we're going to bury it for many years, and then we're going to revisit that. So that's the part 2 of our food sovereignty project, and I'm pretty excited about that. And and the final one is our collaborative archaeology school that we have with the in partnership with the anthropology just this summer, spring of this year. And that was a really interesting site. Obviously it's very old. It's one of our long lasting villages that are still existing, and it's actually been looted several times, and we didn't really know what we were getting into, just because there was so many looters on site there. And it is an Attawattaran site, so it is dated back to Six Nations and Six Nations people, along also with the Anishinaabe. And we're pretty excited. So we had roughly about 20 students from McMaster participate, and we had the HDI, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and also our crew to go out and work alongside and teach, and just work together and on the Sealy site with the students to, just to talk about and understand what good archaeology field practices are. And it was also opened up to the community. We had different people stop through. I think awareness is, going to be key. So we're going to also be doing next year Actually, I don't even think I think it's going to be the end of summer. We're going to do another community awareness. So I'm going to bring this to either the community hall or the gathering place where we're going to take our results from all the projects, and I'm going to open it up to the community to let them know what we've been doing from the archaeology at the Six Nations Archaeology Office, and just share and see for next year if there is any community members who would like to. It was kind of like sort of like a pilot this year just to see how it would all unfold. So, yeah, so we're going to rent that and we're going to describe, some of the results from, and I don't have none of the results yet. I think we just finished about a week and a half ago. So we're just in discussions of the results from the Sealy site. And, yeah, so I think that is sort of it for me. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my role is more behind the scenes and trying to create equity in knowledge production. With the amazing work that Tanya's been doing and a number of folks at McMaster, and as I travel around Haudenosaunee communities, I'm always just blown away by the work that the communities are doing in their partnerships. And the one thing is that we don't really have the opportunity, because we're all wearing 10 hats, to sit down and share or talk about our research, particularly with archaeology and anthropology. So I'm on the flip side where I'm talking more to the knowledge holders and working with them and kind of working backwards to what sites and what information they want from archaeology. So starting with the living to move backwards in history. And our heritage matters. And I think Allan and Tanya laid it out incredibly well in terms of to not have access to our own heritage in our own lands is a very sorrowful situation to be in when you look at the beautiful history that Haudenosaunee people have. This is a painting by Raymond Sky, and it's about the sharing of different matters that our people were dealing with 900 years ago along the Bay of Quinte. And so I'm looking at the stories and collecting what they call ethnographies and looking at pulling those together in order to rebuild so much information that was lost through colonialism, residential school, and taking the guidance from elders. And I think, situating our people as, important in the story of these lands, and to be sitting, where I stayed in cultural anthropology because I felt more in control of being able to navigate that world because archaeology was so limited in terms of our ability to be included in that story. So if we move to the next slide, I'm not going to go over the details, just in terms of McMaster, the reason I think they are where they are today is because we've had a 30-some year relationship where Confederacy leaders were having events at McMaster at a time that this just wasn't happening at any university, where they were presenting their histories and their knowledges from all over North America and learning from each other. And we were just the audience. We were listening as academics, as students. And that led to the establishment of Indigenous study, but it set the right tone for McMaster to engage with our people, which was about equity, collaboration, sharing of resources, and building more pathways. And I think the reason that those knowledge holders spent time, precious time at McMaster doing these events and engagement is because they could see exactly what we're doing today. Like they understood this ability to work together was going to be needed so that we could respectfully engage and rebuild what was lost to us because we were essentially erased and then rebuilt in a colonial lens. Whereas we want to bring our languages back and our knowledges back so that we can give our children a future. Because as we know, we're all we're all in a situation globally that they were talking about in 1990 and warning of these things. So really being able to match our historical record, our heritage with contemporary realities is the side that I kind of work on by choice, simply because I felt so limited and constrained when I was taking archaeology as a undergrad. So if we move on, the next slide, I talk a bit about, people kind of don't know what is Indigenous knowledge, what is traditional ecological knowledge, and what are we trying to do? And I think, under the United Nations, under UNDRIP, as well as, all the calls from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, they're all calling for a change in research. And where Indigenous knowledge lands is central to that. And it's really about our own epistemologies and scientific inquiries, which we had engineering, which is why we need to offer courses. And I am talking and we do have a grant to do those changes in the sciences where we understand the history of our people and the contributions we had made prior to colonialism, to medicine, to political philosophies of democracy, to agricultural contributions, medicine, and so on. And we don't, nobody learns that. So Indigenous knowledge is wholly focused on that knowledge system and often within the language and passed on the way that our people traditionally did, which is often experiential. Traditional ecological knowledge is where archaeology has come into my research and other folks' research, just for the reasons that Tanya laid out with food systems, food sovereignty, looking at the history of our river systems, how we traveled, where we traveled. All of those things require different levels of science. So we work with a number of biologists, chemical and civil engineering. We work with medicine and health, looking at pandemics and epidemics and epidemiology. So it really is holistic, and it's actually really complex. And there's not a lot of people that want to jump into this holistic, what we call interdisciplinary work, but that's what tech is. It's epigenetics. It's looking at the history of our lands, our environment, and the human species that live there. So it's including the songs, the arts, the dance, which are often our records of when things changed, when the landscapes changed, when different events happen, are encoded in our, not only our wampum belts, but in our songs and in our ceremonies. And that's the kind of historical record that I trace to try to understand what our people were doing, 500 years ago. How did they survive the different waves of epidemics and so on? So those are the fascinating facts that tie us back to archaeology. Do you want to pass on? Yeah. So part of what we're doing is we're developing terra stories. And I learned about it when I went to the Amazon. I was working with the Mato Wara Xingu in the Mato Grosso in Brazil. And I've worked with the Amazon conservation team for 20 some years. And they had the indigenous people mapping their entire rainforest so that people could understand these are not empty lots of trees with nothing going on, but they're in fact, pharmaceutical, agriculturally influenced environments. So I thought, well, if they could do it, we should be able to do it. And as we started developing, I talked to the knowledge holders and to the leadership, and they really wanted all the archaeological sites that we could at least access and document of Haudenosaunee people mapped around the Great Lakes. They wanted to see that history in a visual way that they could interact with. So I used the terra stories and taught STEAM Academy students, Gaiwaneo. We engaged with a number of people, as well as today working with Cornell and their classes in archaeology who are doing mapping of the Tutelo. So we're working together, and I'm trying to bridge these knowledges. And the only way that we can really do that in a data central way is through mapping and demonstrating. So the digital map, you can click. Stuff can be what you call restricted, so that each nation, they don't want to share particular things that can be restricted, which is why I like this particular app that we now work with. And it's about also protecting various sites, places that people may not know the history of those areas and why we consider them or would identify them as sensitive or sacred areas that we would like to protect. So being able to pull that knowledge is part of rebuilding our nation, our history. How are people moved around the Great Lakes? What did they do? And one of the stories that Emily Anson, who is my PhD student and in archaeology and interested in decolonizing archaeology, worked with faith keepers and clan mothers to develop the peacemaker story. And we wanted to map out, and then COVID hit and things kind of changed, but I think we're still going to finish that work because we're now with the Global Climate Change Center. We also partnered with the Canadian Geographic on their map around the Great Lakes, and Jock, a traditional knowledge holder and secretary to the Confederacy, told the stories of how Niagara Falls was created, what our relationship to Niagara Falls is, and the history of the Great Lakes in general, how they were formed according to our stories. So again, it's bringing to life for our people to see where these historical areas are, why we treat them a certain way, and why we understand heritage from a lens of the living, but also recognizing and respecting those ancestors that have gone before us. So part of it is developing curriculum and why I partnered with Canadian Geographic is because they were developing curriculum for schools in Ontario and across Canada. And I wanted these stories shared so people understand this is our history and told by our point of view. So I thought that was really important project to engage in. We're still working with them on, they're going to be recording one of the knowledge holders at the Grand River talking about the Tutelo and how they moved from around the area that they came from and came to Six Nations, what happened to them that they no longer are among us. The elder that I'm working with, or knowledge holder, doesn't want that knowledge to be lost, much like you were talking about the neutral, Allan. I was surprised when I said of all the things he wanted to talk about in the Grand River was the Tutelo, and he said, but we don't want these people forgotten or erased. So they're going to be doing that sometime in August. So again, working with the stories to kind of relate it back to the archaeology is kind of the opposite way that I work, and then being able to demonstrate based on the sites that we can map. That's our goal, is to show both the sites that the archaeology students from Cornell have been working on, and we've been assisting them with their knowledge holders, and then bringing that, how they moved, and also including food in that, because one of the researchers from Native Studies at Cornell has been following the Tutelo's corn, because they had a very specific foods that they brought with them. So again, it matches in some ways some of the work that you're all doing, but I find that everywhere I go, every time I hear Haudenosaunee people projects, I'm like amazed at how there's a synergy of information, and what we're missing in all of this is the ability to pull that all together, to bring all of that information to our people so that it becomes part of their lessons and what they're learning in their schools, rather than the things that they're currently being told about our people. Next slide. So I've been partnering with Six Nations Polytechnic. McMaster has, again, a very, almost when we started Indigenous Studies, the first thing, our people community, we did a little survey at the Drumbeat Conference, and they all said they wanted the students, they didn't want affirmative action, they wanted improving of skills, and they wanted that to happen in the community. And at the time, the president and vice president, Heiderbrecht of McMaster, assisted in terms of finding the funding so that we could establish Six Nations Polytechnic through McMaster, was a leader in that at that time, because they had the collaborative relationship already in place through the President's Committee, which is now the Indigenous Education Council. And through that, there's 6 universities that already have memorandums of understanding about sharing credits. So my goal is to support the work that Tanya's doing, support the field school, but get our students into that programs because we need archaeologists, we need Indigenous archaeologists, we need Indigenous engineers, we need Indigenous biologists. And so my new passion as I'm retired is to solely focus on creating pathways and equity and knowledge production so their own people will become leaders in these fields and support each other. Currently, Tanya's out there fighting kind of on her own, and then you might have another archaeologist in the States fighting, and they need support, and the only way to do that is building capacity. So what the knowledge holders in the community have identified is they would really like a sustainable environmental Haudenosaunee Research Center, and this would allow us to answer the phone when somebody calls and says, do you want, and right now what I'm hearing is we're all so busy that a lot of really good opportunities fall to the wayside because we simply can't handle the volume of interest, the goodwill that's out there right now. We just don't have anybody responding to work on it. Our research center would allow graduate students to intern. They would allow field schools to become accredited and to have sustainable mentorship, but accreditation for the work that they're doing. It would allow community members who are often doing a lot of the research and contribution to actually end up with a master's degree rather than a citation in an article. So these are the types of things where we want to move forward together with McMaster and the leadership to build our own research capacity in community, along with training, especially in the fields of archaeology and other areas that we're missing from. So we're working on this diligently. Next slide. I'm trying to wrap this up so that we can again connect our people back to the history of the land, to the heritage sites, because currently much of that knowledge is not being passed down. It's a very small group of people that kind of have this knowledge, and the goal is to get it to a larger audience, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and build that resilience that our community needs so that we can pass this information and begin changing the way archaeology is done, but with a force of many, many people rather than the few that are in there trying to challenge the government and the restrictions that they've put on our own heritage. So the goal is to create that capacity and begin to accredit a lot of these land-based, field-based work that people are doing, and not to impose or change anything, just to find ways to work together to create a pathway for our students to then become archaeologists. So it's moving in that direction, and that's part of self-determination. So if you want to go ahead. So part of our team, if it just gives you an idea of what my research team looks like, we have, on the left, postdoc in engineering, Emily Anson, who's archaeology, my student there, Hillary's health, embedded with Six Nations Health, and Rohini's history from U of T, embedded with Six Nations Polytechnic. And in the background are all the community research knowledge holders that guide our research. They tell us what to focus on, what they're interested in, what they want to know. And then we go out and get the resources and the skill sets to pull that off. And one of the things they want is those archaeology sites mapped out so our people can see the different timelines that we moved around, where we settled, so they understand, we lived on reserves, and people kind of have a mentality of the world is this reserve, when really we had 6 million acres around the Great Lakes that we occupied, and we were large, 20 or more thousand people living together and moving around. So these are, Jock is one of our knowledge advisors and doing some of the work with us throughout the last 6-7 years, along with some other really good folks from the community. But they're the ones that tell me this is how I want it done. So when Jock says, okay, the biology that Mark Servos did on the Grand River, identifying all the different fish species, can you get that in all 6 languages? And I'm like, I was going to do good to just do it in Mohawk. But our kids need biology texts and they need science texts in the language. That doesn't exist currently. So if, my children went through immersion, they don't have access because it doesn't exist in Mohawk or Cayuga. So again, it's about filling the need that the community has, which is building the capacity by creating the resources that don't exist. So as Tanya was talking about the need to kind of pull together the information, that's what we do, but we want to make sure it goes back to the kids and it's taught in the schools so that our people become comfortable with where younger, newer archaeology students that I've met, as well as young, people like Scott Martin, who are just amazing. I want them to be around that instead of what they've heard about, the bad rap essentially that archaeology has in the community, which is why our people turn away from it, in order for them to see this is a new era under reconciliation. We have a new generation of thinkers and researchers, and we are working to decolonize archaeology. So my goal is to get them comfortable in working in these areas and with other sciences so that we can begin controlling our heritage sites, because it's not going to happen until we have a greater contribution to make, if you will, by becoming archaeologists, becoming anthropologists, working towards these goals, as well as importantly, taking leadership from our community, which I've done the last 30 years, and it has served my career. I have not suffered because I listen to the community and design research based on what they want, how they want that done, and in what time frame they want things done. And then I go out and seek great people who are, again, there is no shortage of the amount of goodwill that's coming from faculty in academia, not just at McMaster, but across many places. Part of that work needs a house. Currently, all the people I employ work from their home because we simply don't have space. So the next slide is kind of the vision of pulling all of our people together. We have over 50 PhDs that are Haudenosaunee, and they're all interested in working together, sharing data, sharing resources. Cornell is just one example. If I had time, I would be working with UB and many other places. So creating a space for a research hub for not only in Haudenosaunee scholars, but also our knowledge holders who are researchers and interested in research, particularly archaeology, anthropology. We want to be able to have kind of a place for them to pull together. So mapping this is part of that project. We can go forward. I'm trying to wrap it up. We'll get to the knowledge holders in the Indigenous Knowledge Center that McMaster passed through Senate around the year 2000, when again we were looking at pulling together archives, being able to access, because just like, and it's not as bad as archaeology, but still, in order to get in, the anthropology archives, you needed you need to sign off. So, bringing these things home is so important. So what if we were to bring home the collections that you and Tanya have mentioned? Where would we put them? And how would they be interpreted? How would they be handled? We don't currently have a home. While Polytech has, our archival space, and they have knowledge holders to assist in managing and stewarding what we do have, we need another area that we would be able to house so much of this work, which is the next slide. I'll just pass on this. I'll leave this up. So if you want to know some of the tenets, but what we did with Nature at McMaster, they funded the building of land-based learning, which again, archaeology falls in it. We call it land-based learning. Academia calls it field research. It's one and the same thing. So what we want to do is have a space. This is in the shape of a turtle, and it would have upper floor. We have 30 acres along the Grand River that we've identified. We've done assessments, and we want to build a home for not only our science that we'll be collecting, whether it's, seeds, ancient seeds, protecting our seas, a climate change lab to monitor, but also there's a historical piece because we've done eDNA on the Grand River, and a water lab, of course, because of the issues. And I've been uncovering that these issues go back to the 1800s with contaminated water that actually made our people sick. So being able to connect, again, historical records is important in the storytelling that our knowledge holders are doing us. So again, I work backwards rather than the other way around. And then being able to do, sustainable food systems and training our young people on how to basically live off the land again, and be accredited for managing, stewarding our land bases is really important. So all of this is about creating a home so that we can be equal partners, not only to McMaster, who's a leader in many ways in this field, but to Waterloo, to Guelph, to Windsor, to University of Buffalo, to Cornell. Like we're all working on Haudenosaunee knowledge and history and heritage, but we don't have a place to share that and develop, an entire program that could be accredited, could be a minor across campus and a full major at Six Nations Polytechnic. So through those MOUs, I think we will be able to achieve that. And there is a lot of support currently at McMaster for that. Next slide. I think we wrap it up a bit here on how we want to expand our consortium so that we're including as many people that work with Haudenosaunee heritage, knowledge, language, all of the interdisciplinary areas, and pull that together under one home, and how we might do that with the land-based focus, because we don't want to teach based in a classroom, sitting looking at a lecture board, because our people really don't respond to that very well when you're trying to teach them about managing ecologies and the waters. We need to have access to those things. So again, it's building accreditation, and we're hoping that, I've asked Emily to reach out. She's been working with a number of you to develop that, so that we could have accredited courses offered not only by McMaster for McMaster students, but they would be offered at Six Nations Polytechnic for our own people. So these so far are the people that we've been working with, and we've also have many other stakeholders that are collaborating on this vision. And I really believe that we need to be equitable partners in privilege and resources and capacity so that we can engage in many of these things that you're talking about. Because currently, I'm sure the human resources here, as well as many other communities, is not at optimum. And we'd like to improve that because we believe change will happen and decolonial research will really begin to take off when we're equal partners and have our own infrastructure to do research as proper collaborators. So that's where I'll leave it. And I'm happy to answer questions if you want to know more. All our publications, both community as well as scholarly, are all posted on Onigenos website, as well as our current research projects. Now, I thank you.
So I'll just sort of wrap this up really quick. Obviously, as Dawn and Tanya pointed out, as well as myself, there's a clear indication here that systems in archaeology in Ontario need to change in relation to the policies that regulate the system, and we need to go further on Indigenous engagement and look for getting Indigenous consent to do archaeology in Ontario. We also probably need modifications to the Ontario Heritage Act and the standards themselves. They should be updated. And archaeology in university programs needs greater funding for Indigenous archaeology and education and training. We need to think systemically about the problems in Ontario archaeology and how we can amend the system that we have right now. The burden shouldn't fall on Indigenous communities or individual archaeologists, such as ourselves, to make these changes. This is something that has to come from above and trickle down to us. There should be a consultation for all archaeological sites, and consultation with the reforming of any legislation as well that is enacted by the government to enforce a new system. Oh, sorry, I went backwards. So I want to end just before questions, essentially, as well, is what can alumni and the public do? We can use our voices and the networks to advocate support for Indigenous-led archaeology and heritage stewardship. We can fund Indigenous students in archaeology and heritage programs, encourage Ontario CRM firms and municipalities to build real, lasting relationships with Indigenous communities. Stop looking at Indigenous communities as an obstacle development, but as a partner in development and the management of archaeological resources or heritage items. The other thing is, I think that it's important to consider, perhaps even with questions that come to us, is the threats that new legislation we've all heard about are sort of posing to the system that we have right now with Bill 5 in Ontario. And C5 at the federal level. C5 is more of a mystery as to what that's all going to involve. But Bill 5 is a definite sort of threat to undermine archaeology and consultation with Indigenous communities. And these are steps that are in the opposite direction. So how much further will this new legislation dispossess Indigenous communities from their heritage is a very good question to think about. So, closing reflections. Archaeology isn't just about the past, it shapes what stories we value today. CRM archaeology in Ontario stands at the moment at a crossroads. It can either continue to uphold a colonial framework of engagement and consultation, or evolve into a more meaningful tool of reconciliation, one that enriches Indigenous community histories through respectful collaboration and fully informed consent. So without further ado, Christine, I guess we'll open the floor to questions that we can all answer.
Oh, thank you, Allan, and thank you, Tanya and Don, for a very enlightening talk. I have to say, you know, I'm a settler, and I took some notes here, and I am flabbergasted at some of the situations that, you know, that first of all, Indigenous communities, or sorry, like archaeological sites, they don't have to be, the artifacts don't have to be given back. Like they can just end up on someone's nightstand, or yeah, it's truly shocking. And I guess, you know, Allan, you sort of ended the presentation with saying, you know, we need to change the systems. But then when we have something like, so I'm like, oh, okay, as a settler, I think government has to get involved to change the systems. But then we have Bill 5 and we have C5, and obviously the people who could change the system have their own agendas. Yeah. So what are, you know, you put up something about like what can people do, but what should we, as settlers, should we contact our MPPs and our MPs and talk about how we really need to be mindful of Indigenous heritage, and that we just don't literally want to plow over it?
Well, I would say part of the archaeological process can actually involve plowing through a site that has been historically plowed to bring to the surface. So I wouldn't say plowing over it, because it is one of the ways we find archaeological sites, but maybe that process needs to be refined and adjusted as well. It's a good point. I would say definitely there is times when the community can provide feedback on bills such as Bill 5. There was actually an open period where archaeologists, I know I'm part of the Ontario Archaeological Society, as well as my company contacted me about providing feedback and commentary on the problems with Bill 5. But I think on an individual level within a community, people can, send a letter to their MPPs about why they think heritage in a community is valuable and is important, Indigenous heritage, or even, settler colonial heritage. I mean, we don't, admittedly, this entire presentation is, of course, about Indigenous cultural heritage, but there are historical heritage sites as well from early settlers that are under threat from the similar legislation. So, I don't know, Tanya, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, I can chime in on this as well. I think that allyship should be, you know, we're going to need you to ally with us, the settlers, because, you know, right now with these bills, and I generally, my approach is, okay, this is what the media is saying. Sometimes you hear everything from the media first. So then I pick up the phone and send the email out with, for instance, with the Bill 5, I reached right directly out to the Minister of the MCM there, and I said, hey, can I have a meeting, and can you, I know what I'm reading, but can you tell me, and from, you know, from your avenue, what does this all mean? I want to hear this from you. I don't want to read it and interpret it on my own. I want to know what exactly you're saying. So I did get from the Ontario Heritage Act side of it. And I also am waiting for an upcoming meeting on the streamlining side of it, which would be the Ontario economical, whatever that is, special economic zone. That's what it's called. And I haven't met with them yet, but I'm looking forward to. But we're going to need everyone to ally, because I think that the study impacts, people don't really understand. So through that special economic zones, you know, it's bridges, housing developments, road infrastructure, all of that is going to impact us. And if we're not going to be doing environmental studies anymore, my greatest concern alongside of the archaeology is water. How are we going to have that study on a longevity of what, you know, if our water sources are going to be clean, you know, in 2021, which we know they're not, to 2051? You know, what is that longevity? And then all of a sudden in 2020, you know, 5, we're going to chop off, and we're not going to have those studies of impact anymore. So that's a real concern for me. And that's not just going to affect Indigenous people. This is going to affect settler communities, the general public at large. I go to sites, say in Waitfleet. I went to meet with their municipality and their county office one day, and it was just like people coming in with bottled water testing, and I'm like, whoa, I've never seen anything like this before. And besides, like in our own community with our water concerns. And so that, for instance, if those studies ain't going to happen any longer, like we're going to be, you know, are we going to be ridden with cancers? Are we going to be, you know, just like the whole Ontario population, right? So I really think that we need a lot of allies to, you know, combat back at these bills, because streamlining obviously is going to be completely dangerous, because not only with the impact on archaeological sites, what if we impact burial? What if we impact a village site? That's going to hold things up longer. Right now, we do have a system in place. It's not a good system. It is a working system. It's not to our expectation, but we're somewhere moving forward. So I think with those bills and how we can have that support from everyone at large is going to be critical, because it's not going to just affect us. You know, it deeply is on our heritage, but also that the water studies, the environment, the birds, you know, we need to all breathe the same air. So that's kind of my thoughts. Thank you, Noah.
Yeah, I agree. We need allyship, particularly universities who carry some weight. With our, you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the reports that have come out 2018 and 2021, identifying Indigenous people are in fact stewards of, you know, 85% of the world's biodiversity. Importantly, where they manage their lands, which we do not. Just like we don't manage our heritage in Canada, we don't control the Grand River, because if we did, it would not be as polluted as it currently is as our source water. So, you know, supporting Indigenous people, at least at the UN level and the global level on the climate change crisis, they're beginning to realize the data has spoken. So aligning with us is really about aligning with things that I think many Canadians are invested in, such as, you know, having a future for their children, having protecting clean source water, and making sure that we manage our environment. But also, you know, looking at the history of Canada is really looking at the history of First Nations people, Indigenous people, you know, and without that history, you become, recolonizers, which is really essentially what this bill is. It's taken the 5 steps we've moved forward under reconciliation and just stripping it right back, similar to what the US is doing, but it's always wrapped in nicer language and kinder language, but it is the same exact outcome, which is erasing Indigenous people in multiple ways, not just in heritage, but also, contaminating source water, which is an issue they face in the US as well. So I think protecting and working with Indigenous people, if you look at history, if you talk about the early explorers who were all dying from scurvy and we helped them, to heal the women, the midwives, how babies being born. There was a time we did collaborate. And I think we need to go back to that early settler engagement where we actually relied on each other for many different reasons to come back to that. And I think universities play a critical role in that advocacy in terms of supporting Indigenous people through reconciliation. I hope and I believe that the support is there, but I do believe working as a collective under our institutions does carry some weight as well as individual support.
Yes, and I think on that note, we are stronger when we work together.
Yeah.
If I could even add one other comment just to sort of illuminate how dangerous Bill 5 is for archaeological sites. I just brought up our previous slide here with the stage forward and mitigation of development impacts. If you can imagine, this is one of the largest sites found in Ontario. This site had over 93 longhouses on it, and it had just the cultural heritage value and significance of this site. It's unparalleled. It truly almost represents a capital city of the past for this time period on this area. If you watch the video about the Curse of the Axe and about this site, it's estimated that these people farmed out a diameter of 14 kilometers around the village for corn. So they cleared 14 kilometers of area to farm corn for feeding this village and sending potentially corn to other villages in the area. So, and I say village, but this is truly one of those sites that looks like capital city. And if you can imagine, Bill 5 comes in and says, well, we want to put a mine up in this area, or we want to put up a development. Toyota needs I shouldn't say Toyota, but we need a new car plant for whatever reason in this spot. We're going to not do any archaeological assessment, no environmental assessments. If that's the way Bill 5 is working, based on my understanding with this special economic zone, which admittedly I might be missing something in the text here, then it could potentially wipe out sites like this, wipe them out from existence. You'd never know they were there. Just like Toronto, some parts of Toronto, Hamilton, many major cities sit on top of sites. Even for Colborne's example, large sites are intermixed underneath the inner workings of the cities that are there today. Because at that time when those cities developed, when development was going on them, there was no archaeology done. So I think it's important to consider that these are the type of sites and the cultural heritage that we would be putting at risk with things like Bill 5.
Thank you, Allan. Thank you for reiterating the point about why we should make sure that we understand when bills are coming forward and how that is going to impact everyone. So with that, I think we'll wrap up for the evening. Thank you, Allan, Tanya, and Dawn for joining us. It was a wonderful discussion, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And hopefully you have learned quite a bit. I know I certainly have, and that you'll want to share this recording with others, or you'll want to rewatch it. And like I said, that recording will come out later this evening. So thank you again for tuning in, and we look forward to having you join us again in the future. Thank you, everyone. Take care.